Well, welcome, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We're very pleased this afternoon, this evening, this morning to be welcoming Amit Sengupta to talk about the political economy of health. The objectives for this session are as listed here: to think about the knowledge needed, the conceptual tools needed to understand the political and economic structures and dynamics which frame health care and the determinants of health, and to develop the skills needed to apply these tools. Amit is not required to convey all of these tools to all of us today, but to present a perspective on the political economy of health. Amit, welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. Can you talk a bit about what made you into an activist in the first place? Where did you come from?
Thank you very much, David, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and sorry to get all of you out of whatever you people do on a Sunday, but I do hope that you'll enjoy our discussions. So David, coming back to what you asked, well, there is no sort of seminal situation or event that led to me being an activist. It was a kind of a seamless transition from starting off as a student activist, as medical students way back in the 1970s. We were involved in organizing perhaps what is still the largest strike by medical students. It started in Delhi and spread to most parts of India. And then as resident doctors involved in issues that the resident doctors associations were involved in, so an activist still, and then moving on to larger areas of health and healthcare, and possibly if we are really talking about one event which in a sense motivated me to be some kind of a lifetime activist, it would have to be the 1984 Bhopal gas leak, which for some of you who would not know is possibly the largest industrial genocide ever. It happened in the factory of what was called Union Carbide at that time, and millions of tons of toxic gas engulfed the city of Bhopal, and an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people were killed. So for many of us who were part of the science and the health movement, that was a turning point.
Sorry, Amit, can I just get you to repeat? 5,000 to 10,000 people killed, did you say?
That's right. The official figures are 3,500 and something. That's the registered figures. But unofficial estimates say that about 10,000 people were killed in the city of Bhopal. About 3,500 initially, but over the years, a lot more succumbed to the effects of the gas. It was a very toxic gas called MIC, methyl isocyanide. So for many of us, it sort of made the connection between the necessity to do something about human greed, which can have this kind of an impact on people's lives. And so that was one of the maybe important turning points of my decision to continue being an activist, and here I am.
So what does being an activist mean to you, Amit?
Well, first of all, being an activist means working with people. For me, the test of an activist is that if she or he is able to get more people together, a lot more people together, to organize them for organized action, to change, to bring about change in the situation that we find ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, that can be channelized through an organization, that can be channelized through a movement, through a number of movements. But the test of an activist is that an activist is an organizer for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Amit. Maybe we should just ask you to get on with the substance of tonight's discussion, which is about the political economy of health. I've distributed a couple of emails about this in the last week. It seems to me that this is the pivot of our IPOL course in a way. It's that everything spins around the political economy of health. And so I think we're all waiting with great interest to hear your story. So take it away. Amit, thanks very much.
Thank you, and I hope people find the story interesting. Can you see the Can we see the presentation now? Can you see the presentation now? David, do you read me?
Go. Everything's fine, Amit, go.
Okay. So thank you again for all of you who are online. And what I'm going to do today is share with you a story. And in many ways, this is a story of human greed. It is also a story of the boundless limits to which human greed can take us. And in some ways, it is also a story of how stupid at times, for a better word, we as a collective people can be and are at times. Now, 150 years back, Rudolf Virchow, who many people consider one of the founders of public health, said that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. And Virchow was absolutely spot on, because much of what we discuss when we discuss medicine, when we discuss healthcare, and when we discuss health, has to do with the larger architecture of politics and of economics. And that is why probably David was talking earlier about how pivotal this understanding of the architecture of economics and politics is for us to understand what happens in the area of health and healthcare. Now, to start a discussion, I'll start from what is loosely termed as globalization today, because it is the dominant paradigm that determines politics and economics in the world. And it is crucial for our understanding of how the world today is run by different forces and how different power relations determine whether we live or die. Now, what is globalization? It means different things to different people. If we were to, for example, close our eyes and think of globalization, what is the image that we think of? For a lot of people, globalization is about consumer goods, access to consumer goods, global brands, Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's, Starbucks, Levi's, internet and email, relocation of industries in the South, visas for people to go and work in US and Europe. Maybe if we close our eyes, we can also think of other things that we see around us, many of which relate to globalization: war, occupation, poverty, health, HIV/AIDS in Africa, increase in the number of global poor, environment, climate change. The short point that I'm trying to make is that as activists, the first thing that is important for us is to make a distinction between the impact of general advances as a result of human endeavor and the formal effects of globalization. Or to be more precise, neoliberal globalization, and I say formal effects because neoliberal globalization is the manner in which capitalism works today. It is a feature and an integral part of modern day capitalism. And that is why it has such a large impact on our lives, no matter where we live. Now, what is neoliberal globalization? Now, again, the phrase neoliberal really starts from the use of the word liberal, that we are talking about a set of policies, a set of endeavor which reduces control by government and allows, as is characteristic of neoliberal globalization, strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Now, a lot of people today forget that neoliberal globalization in the developing world had its beginnings, or the model had its beginnings, in one of the bloodiest phases of human history in Chile by the dictator Pinochet, who overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. And this was a model that was used by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the UK and US. And over a period of time, it came to become the major way in which affairs were to be run across the globe. And the essential elements included deregulation of trade, investment, and labor markets, and privatization of public services. No, it's not as if Reagan and Thatcher and Pinochet sort of just woke up and thought that this is the way to go. The genesis of neoliberal globalization lies in a crisis. And paradoxically, it lies in a crisis of plenty. And to understand that, I'll take you back a few decades to just after the end of the Second World War. And to the period between 1945 and 1970, what has been termed as the Golden Age of Capitalism, a period of relative peace and economic growth, typified by huge reconstruction in Europe after the war. Also a period when a number of countries in Asia and Africa were breaking the shackles of colonialism and were building their own destinies. And this is a phase when actually you had an unprecedented growth in productive capacities at a global scale. Almost in all continents, in most countries, you have a rise in our ability to produce, produce goods that people were to consume in their respective places. And then the situation changed. And the change came with the crisis in the 1970s. One of the drivers of this crisis was what was called the oil price shock in 1973, when the oil producing countries, especially the countries in what is called the Middle East, hiked the prices of oil manyfold over a period of weeks to months. Now, this was a situation when already the capitalist economies, which had seen huge rates of growth, were starting to flatten out. The rates of growth of their economies were starting to be much flatter. The oil price shock had a tremendous effect on capitalist economies because they're dependent on cheap fossil fuels, petroleum and coal. Now, this led to a situation when economies started slowing down even faster, especially in the developed world. So it starts as a crisis of capitalism in developed countries, in Europe, in the United States. Along with it, there was another situation that was unraveling, which was the former socialist countries in East Europe and in the Soviet Union were starting to collapse. And as a result, much of the developing world, which had received support from the socialist countries, were exposed entirely to the predations of global capital represented by countries in Europe and North America. Now, this crisis had certain very curious features, and I'll go a bit slowly here so that we just are able to understand and grasp what this was all about. While productive activities, that is, activities which are geared towards producing goods that can be used by people, while productive activities were slowing down, at the same time, paradoxically, there was a lot of money that had accumulated. This money was in the hands of a large number of multinational corporations who had benefited from the economic boom of the previous decades. They were stashed away by dictators in some of the countries of the developing world, like Marcos and Mobutu and others. It was money that was accumulated very fast by countries in the Gulf region who are now rich from the high revenues they earned from the sale of petroleum. And finally, much of this money was stashed away in the large capitalist banks. So on one hand, you had production going down. On the other hand, you had a lot of money that was slowing down. Now, when faced with this situation, what does the global capitalist economy do? There were no avenues to invest in production because there were not people who were able to buy more goods because the economy has already started declining. So the analogy that I like to use is the capitalist economy did something very similar to what the village moneylender does, which is try to push this money into the hands of people who have no money in the form of loans. So you have this phase of what has been called by economists as loan pushing. So banks started pushing loans. Developing countries, poor countries were told, don't worry, we have a lot of money, take as much as you want. Use this money, your people need consumer goods. Your people need cars. They need the latest in electronics. They need the latest televisions. Take loans, import from us. So this was a phase that the capitalist economy used to get out of its own crisis, and typically, and this is typical of how capitalist economies try to pass on the impact of the crisis onto the developing countries and the poorer countries. So this is what happened just after the crisis had started engulfing the rich countries of the north. Now, obviously, this was unviable. Just like the village moneylender entraps the poor peasant, so the capitalist banks and the lenders entrapped the poor countries into what came to be called the debt trap. The loans were unviable because it was soon obvious that these countries were not in a position to pay back the loans. And in fact, there is a lot of data which shows that over this period, the amount of development assistance that were coming into the developing countries was much less than the amount of money that was going out of these countries to service the debt, to pay off the interests on the debt. Now, this is where the global, what I call the global economic police force, the International Monetary Fund, stepped in. The countries of the developing world were now in a crisis. They were in a debt trap. And they were told that we have a simple solution for you. You can't pay back your loans? Good. We'll give you more loans to repay the loans that you cannot pay back. But now, unlike earlier, these loans will come with conditionalities. You will be able to survive. You will be able to pay back your loans only if you agree to these conditionalities. And these became the infamous structural adjustment program. So just, if you stop here and think about how the crisis, which starts as a crisis in the developed capitalist world, has successfully been transferred now to the developing countries across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So what were these conditionalities of structural adjustment programs? So the first, sell off your national assets. Sell off the public assets of the public sector, which was called privatization. Allow foreign goods, and importantly, allow foreign money to come in to your country as it pleases, on its own terms, called liberalization. And finally, integrate your economies with the global economy in a regime of global trade, globalization. So these three put together, the infamous LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization formula, was what characterized the structural adjustment programs. Now, countries in the developing world at that point were sold a dream. They were told that if you integrate into the global economy, you will be part of the people who will gain about from the rapid expansion of the global economy. The truth actually was entirely different. In fact, within about 15 years, global trade had increased something like 3 to 4 times. But the share of the developing countries had actually fallen. The share of the least developed countries had actually fallen in global trade. So it was clear who was benefiting from global trade. Now, these prescriptions These conditionalities, if you try to unravel some of them, what did they mean? They meant that governments had to step back from providing basic social services in health, in education, for food sovereignty and security. The market was going to determine what you could buy, which services you could buy. And for them, for those who could not buy from the market, you were supposed to have what was called the safety net. The safety net, which was essentially poor services for poor people so that they can just survive, so that they can just keep providing cheap employment, cheap labor to keep the machine of capitalism turning on and on. So this was what was meant by the safety nets which were supposed to be put in place after the structural adjustment program. Now, you have heard at length in the previous webinar which David Sanders talked about what it meant for health services. It meant governments started spending less on health, user fees were introduced, comprehensive care became selective care, and services got segmented into poor care for the poor and the private sector for the rich. And these were drilled repeatedly in various documents produced by international agencies such as the World Bank. The World Bank, for example, in 1993 came up with the World Development Report, where this formed the major part of what countries should be doing. And this is what it did to the people of the world. Now, this is the story of the last 3 decades and why I called it the ultimate culmination of human greed. It has meant dismantling of public services, and importantly, in the last 3 decades, instead of production being the cornerstone of the capitalist economy, the flow of capital, which means the flow of money in the form of money, has become the cornerstone of the capitalist economy. And over this period, speculative capital, that is capital that is used in a way to gamble. That is why the stock markets of the world have been called the global casinos, because you have huge amounts of money flowing in and flowing out, not doing anything to the productive capacities, not doing anything to help in production, but just money that is used to gamble. This has been the hallmark of the last 3 decades, and the model has survived also by pumping up consumption so that multinational corporations can sell their goods. Consumption that is based on people repeatedly taking loans. And this was a bubble. We say this was a bubble because there was empty air inside. From the outside, it looked huge, but inside there was nothing, because it was not actually promoting any human productive activity. It was gambling with people's lives. And the bubble had to burst. And it burst, and 5 years back, you had the bubble bursting at a global scale, starting with the United States. And you were confronted with multiple crises. The 3 F's, the financial, the food, and the fuel crisis, 2007, 2008. And the 2, what we call the slow burn crisis, the climate crisis and the crisis of development. So one planet engulfed in these crises. What is different? what is important to understand is these crises were a systems failure of capitalism itself. These were not, contrary to what many capitalist economists would still try to tell you, these are not transient crises. These are not something that will pass away. These reflect a deep failure of the system of capitalism. And it is manifest in the persistence of global economic inequality. It is manifest in finance capital playing the major role in global affairs and not productive activities. It is manifest in the way global economic integration is unequal and benefits some much more than it benefits others. And on top of it, we have an ineffective and undemocratic global governance system. Now, just to have an idea of the impact and extent of the financial crisis, everybody says that it's the greatest since the largest and most serious since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, by October 2000, the banks were bailed out because the banks were what they said. They said that the banks were too big to fail. People could die. Whole populations could be pushed into poverty, but the banks had to be bailed out. And the banks were bailed out by countries in the North, in Europe, in the United States to the tune of 2,200 billion, or to put it in a different way, more than the income of the poorer half of the world's population. So this was the extent of the economic crisis. Now, we can understand the speculative investment, how the speculative investment fueled this crisis, because when the crisis broke, there was actually no shortage. There was no shortage of oil. There was no shortage of food. When the crisis broke, for example, production of petroleum had increased and consumption was falling, yet prices increased from $90 to $132. This crisis is not just unidimensional. Today it is integrated with the serious threat that the planet faces, the threat of climate change that threatens human existence. And if you really look at the connections, you'll find them. Part of the crisis in food lay in the fact that the United States and European Union countries were shifting agricultural land for the use of biofuels. Climate change is already starting to reduce food production. Major droughts in Australia, rice yields in Asia coming down. Climate change is also increasing the vulnerability of the poorest developing countries, particularly to the food and fuel crisis. And while production is being relocated in the South, in the global South, it is still production that is for the demand in the North. So the dirty industries are moving to the countries of the South to feed the consumption demands of the countries in the North. Now, so that is why we call this an interrelated crisis of global economic inequality, financial sector dominance, unequal integration of economies, and ineffective global governance. Now, beyond a point, statistics become numbing. They numb your senses so you don't think about them. But it is important at times to just close our eyes and think of some of these statistics. The richest 10% of the world own more than 85% of the wealth. The world has never been as rich as this. The world has also never been as poor as this. The poorest 50% own only 1.1% of the globe's riches. So we are in a cyclical crisis of capitalism where production is not increasing and money cannot be profitably employed in production, and that is why it has to be employed in gambling. And that is why, as we had talked earlier, the dominant role of the financial sector, of money coming in and going out. The important point here to remember is that this speculative capital also takes a grip on the economies of the poor countries. And so today we have a situation where a financial crisis, which started in the United States, grips the entire world, puts even Europe in a crisis, which earlier was part of the grand coalition of capitalist countries. Parts of Europe today are in a severe crisis. You see that happening in Greece, you see that happening in Spain, you see that happening in parts of Italy and in many other parts of Europe. So this is how today the integrated globe is responding to the crisis. And sitting on top of it is a system of undemocratic global governance where the earlier nation-state driven system, this system of United Nations, however imperfect that was, is giving way to an entirely non-transparent, unaccountable and toothless system. And that is why in Global Health Voice 3, what we talk about is that what you need to redesign the global economic architecture is to fundamentally change the fundamental features of the global capitalist economy today. You cannot expect the same structures which brought about these crises to be able to reform itself. Now, this is where I will now shift to something more concrete in terms of manifestations of neoliberal globalization through its three pillars of wealth accumulation: trade, intellectual property, and investment, and what they mean for our lives and our health. Now, to recapitulate very quickly, the economic crisis of the 70s transferred onto the poor countries, opening up of the markets of the poor countries with the dream of the borderless world, the bait of easy loans, pushing poor countries into the debt crisis and the structural adjustment programs. In the industrial sector, developing countries forced to withdraw support from their own industries, money concentrated in a few hands, and importantly, the restrictions on the flow of money being fewer and fewer, countries being browbeaten to allow money to come in and go out freely, and economies of the poor countries captive to the power of this flow of money. Because if the money can flow in at will, it can flow out at will as well. And in days, this finance capital driven system has the power within days to totally devastate the economy of any developing country just by withdrawing the money out of its market. So this is the kind of integrated system of globalization that we have situated. And it's within this that the World Trade Organization was set up to promote global integration, to promote the integration of countries into the regime of free trade. Now, the word free trade is actually a misnomer, because there was nothing that was free about the trade that the World Trade Organization was going to promote. The World Trade Organization, moreover, promoted not just trade, but a lot of other things that the capitalist economy required. And to understand how it did so, we have to understand how the World Trade Organization is different from its predecessor, which was called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT. Because the World Trade Organization was built to perpetuate an unequal division of labor. In the name of free trade, what it ensured was that those who had the major share of the globe's trade will continue to expand their share, and those who joined in late will continue to have a very small share of the globe's trade. And so you had a transition from GATT to WTO, when, unlike in the earlier times of GATT, the WTO also concerns itself with the domestic economy of countries. It interferes in the way our own economies are regulated at a global level. It also, for the first time, introduced in trade negotiations what are essentially non-trade issues: intellectual property rights, investments, and services. Before that, trade was about trade in goods. Now the World Trade Organization included in the global trade regime intellectual property rights in the form of patents and other forms of rights, investments, capital, and services of any kind, from banking to health to insurance. And the important reason why all these issues were put together in one basket by global capital was that the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization was going to be used and is being used in order to threaten trade sanctions when countries do not comply with the very complex and complicated rules that became part of the World Trade Organization in different areas, not just in trade in goods, but in patent rights, but in the case of allowing investments to flow in and flow out, in the case of services being allowed to come in wherever services wanted to move from the multinational corporations who were providing these services. And finally, the World Trade Organization, hence, was built to promote the flow of money and to secure the monopoly over knowledge through intellectual property rights. Now, this is an area that many of you would probably know about, but I would encourage you to read more. So I'll quickly go over some of the ways in which the World Trade Organization works. It has some principles which are peculiar to the World Trade Organization that has not existed earlier. It has what is called the most favored nation clause, that all countries which are members of the WTO have to treat other members equally. It has a national treatment clause, that you have to treat external corporations, external imports on par with your country's corporations, your country's production. It also does not allow what were called quantitative restrictions and non-tariff barriers. Simply, this means it does not allow the freedom to countries to decide what can be imported in and what cannot be imported. Now, as a result of the trade organization engulfing the entire globe, you have a system now which has an impact on almost every part of our lives. The decisions inside the World Trade Organization are supposed to be taken by a consensus, and if not, by a majority vote. Seems very democratic. But in practice, the consensus in the World Trade Organization is actually a consensus of the graveyard. It is the consensus that is forced on to the weak, that is forced on to the poorer nations by the rich and powerful nations because of bilateral pressures that are put on developing countries and least developed countries. Now, who benefits from this globalized trade regime today? We have three examples here in front of you. The coffee jar that you buy from your supermarket, maybe. The growers finally get only 10%. The growers in the developing world get 10% of it. 90% goes to the exporters, the shippers, the retailers. In the chocolate bar, only 3.9% goes to the farmer who is growing the raw material. In the jeans that you buy, only 12% goes to the people who make the jeans. 54% is the retail market. So you have today a rigged global trading regime. Now, very briefly, within the World Trade Organization agreement, there are specific areas which have an impact on health. And one of them, which all of you would be aware of, is the agreement on intellectual property rights, which we often call patents. Now, the World Trade Organization, what it did was to ensure that all countries follow the same system of patent rights, thereby refusing the right to countries like India to follow a different kind of patent system that earlier did not recognize patents on medicines, for example. Now, there is so much evidence today that patent protection, the kind that we have today, means high prices. Fortunately, India changed over to the new patent system only in 2005. And that is why in 2001, an Indian company was able to offer the same treatment for HIV/AIDS for $350, for which people had to earlier pay $10,000 a month. The HIV epidemic, in many ways, was a human-made epidemic. Now, this actually is typical of how today globalization attempts to reduce the flexibility that poorer countries have to mitigate the impact of the global capitalist crisis. Now, there are various what are called public health flexibilities and safeguards that are part of the TRIPS agreement, which includes governments can use a license in order to produce medicines which are already patented. You have a system of compulsory license where, depending on the kind of grounds that are available in your patent laws, you can have domestic companies producing medicines which are under patents. And these do not have to be just for emergencies. You have the system of parallel import where you can import the cheapest drugs from other countries, even if the drug is under patent. You have the right to decide how high your patent protection is going to be. Your country laws can determine that. You have also the right not to apply patent rights in the case of research, in the case of testing of medicines. The important part to understand is that while almost all developed countries have the strict safeguards in their laws, many developing countries do not have these safeguards. And even when they have these safeguards, they do not use it because of bilateral pressures. The other major issue in the WTO is in services, in the services agreement. Again, I'm not going to go into any great detail. You can read up on this. But I want to only emphasize on one point, that today, manufacturing is no more the strength of the capitalist economies of Europe and the United States. Today, it is the service sector, services of different kind, as I said, banking to insurance to health to education, you name it and you have it. Services are the major factors which are pushing the growth of the economies of Europe and America. And that is why they are interested in pushing services. And in the health sector, they are interested in pushing health services as a tradable commodity. For us, coming from an understanding of public health, coming from an understanding of primary health care, trade in health services is something that is a contradiction. But it is this trade in services that the services agreement is trying to push. And it is trying to push this by reducing regulations in nations which allow freedom for services provided by entities based in other countries. And I want to exit from the issue of health services to flag an important point. In the last webinar, there was a discussion on universal health coverage. Now, universal health coverage means different things to different people. But for neoliberal economics, for global capitalism, please understand it means only one thing. Universal health coverage means another way in which you can make profits. Universal health coverage for them means that people's money can be harnessed for private sector provision of health care, for the insurance industry, for the managed healthcare companies. This is their vision of universal health coverage. And as the People's Health Movement, we have to be vigilant about this vision of universal health coverage, behind which there are powerful interests who wish. Now let us move on to some other aspects, and food sovereignty is obviously integral to health. And one of the principal ways in which the global trade regime hoodwinked developing countries was through the agreement on agriculture. It promised countries in the South that if they open up their trade system, if they integrate into the global trade system, they will be able to sell their agricultural produce at larger profits, at higher profits. But what actually came about is one of the saddest stories of the global trade regime today, that while developing countries reduced or abolished barriers to free trade, developed countries in the area of agriculture continued to use their barriers of free trade. Their barriers of free trade were not removed, and they continued to subsidize their agriculture. As a result, subsidized agriculture from the northern countries, from Europe, from North America, from Australia today is devastating the agriculture of the poor developing countries. Many of you would have heard of this analogy. It is one of the exemplars of the kind of world we live in today, that a cow in Europe gets a per day subsidy, which is more than what 3 billion people in this world subsist upon. So this is really the true phase of the global trade in agriculture. Now, the food crisis, which we talked about earlier, was again not a crisis essentially of shortage. It was a crisis brought about because of speculation, because speculators bought up food stocks and did not want to release these food stocks, and as a result of this speculative trading in food grains, you had a situation where millions actually slept hungry, where hundreds of thousands, probably more than a million, died because of the global food crisis. Because there were a few corporations who were involved in speculative trading of food grains. They had not contributed to the production of food grains. They had not contributed to in any way making available more food. They were only involved in trading, in gambling with the food grains they would buy up and sell at higher prices. So, and data, for example, shows that the height of the boom in speculation on food, 35% of corn, 42% of soybean, and 64% of wheat, which was being traded in the world, were being traded by these speculators. Finally, I am coming to the last part, which is that today the developed countries have extracted what they could have from the World Trade Organization. So they are moving now to what are called the free trade agreements. The free trade agreements, which actually demand even more onerous terms than the World Trade Organization rules do. And the US and the European Union have been signing, the process of signing a number of these free trade agreements. For example, you have the Indo-EU Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now involves 12 countries. It's interesting to note that the TPP was originally an agreement between just 4 countries, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. Suddenly it includes 12 countries, and you have Japan and South Korea waiting to join. So this is how there is a recruitment drive for free trade agreements, because these agreements are providing a second push for trade liberalization. These are an attempt to extract more from developing countries, extract what they could not extract from the World Trade Organization. You have also the investment chapter. So it's not just the intellectual property rights. You have the investment chapters of the free trade agreements, which now lock in countries, which prevent countries to use legislation to protect health. Cigarette companies are suing countries, saying that you cannot prevent us from selling our cigarettes the way we want to. You have water companies suing, saying that you cannot prevent us making private profits. You have what are called the economic partnership agreements between the African and Caribbean countries, which go far beyond what the World Trade Organization demands of it. So this is really the landscape of trade, of investment, and of intellectual property, and how it impacts on us. Make a difference? We have to, and we can. Many of these issues may seem legal and technical, but please understand, finally, most importantly, they are political in nature. As activists, we have to understand these issues, we have to mobilize and build international solidarity. This is a solidarity that has to be anchored locally. In the PHM, we do not advocate only acting globally, devoid of our roots in local communities, in local actions. Actions anchored locally, but connected together to build international solidarity. Remember that the seeds for the defeat of neoliberal globalization have also been sown by the same system. Today, knowledge, if freed from its fetters, can be freely exchanged as never before. Movements can link together as never before. The alter globalization movement that is confronting neoliberal globalization today is a growing movement. The PHM is a part of it. It has to be a part of it. I'll end there with just a few pictures to give you a flavor of how this alter globalization movement today transcends rich and poor countries. It builds bridges between people across countries who want this iniquitous system to end. Thank you very much. And we can take questions after this.
Well, thanks very much, Amit. That's amazing.